Hi, hello. Our group will be discussing or presenting a new lens of analysis, which will be new historicism. But before we fully delve into the concepts, ideas of what new historicism is, let me first give you the contents of our presentation of what you will be expecting to gain knowledge in our report. So first, we have the brief overview or introduction. Second, we have the features of new historicism. Third is the key proponents of new historicism. And fourth, the basic concepts of new historicism. We will be also tackling the difference between the old and new historicism. We will also be discussing what does historicists do and the advantage and disadvantage of using this lens of analysis, and lastly, analyzing Annabel Lee through the lens of new historicism. And now let's start with the overview or introduction of new historicism. Imagine trying to understand a novel without knowing anything about the time period in which it was written. Could we fully grasp The Great Gatsby without the context of the Roaring Twenties? Or Hamlet without considering the political tensions of the Elizabethan era? New historicism, a literary theory that emerged in the late 20th century, argues that literature and history are deeply intertwined. Developed primarily by literary critic Stephen Greenblatt, new historicism suggests that literary texts are not isolated works of art but products of their historical, social, and political environments. This approach challenges the idea that history is a fixed, objective record. Instead, it views history as a collection of narratives shaped by power, ideology, and culture exchange. New historicism does not simply use history to explain literature. It explores both literature and historical documents shape each other. This means that a Shakespearean play and a legal document from the same time period might offer equally valuable insights into the cultural mindset of that era. And now let's move on to the features of new historicism. The first feature we have is contextualization. New historicism insists that we analyze literary works within their historical and cultural context. This includes looking at the social, political, and economic conditions that influence a text creation. For the second feature, we have the intertextuality. Here, this approach highlights how texts interact with one another. A novel doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by other literature, historical events, and societal discourses. For instance, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein can be better understood by examining Enlightenment science and romantic ideals. Third, we have the power dynamics. New historicism often draws from Michael Foucault's theories on power and knowledge, exploring how literature reflects, reinforces, or challenges dominant ideologies. It asks who holds power in this text, whose voices are missing. The fourth feature is cultural exchange. Literature is not just a product of one culture, it is shaped by interactions between different societies. New historicism explores how cultural influences mix, such as how colonialism shaped English literature or how Eastern philosophies influence Western thought. Fifth is focus on non-canonical texts. Unlike traditional literary analysis, which often prioritizes great works of literature, new historicism also examines non-canonical texts such as letters, pamphlets, or political speeches to gain a fuller understanding of a historical moment. Sixth is we have the historical relativism. History is not a single unchanging truth. It is a constructed narrative open to interpretation. New historicism argues that just as literature is shaped by history, history is also shaped by who tells the story and what perspective they choose. Seventh is the reader's role in interpretation. New historicists recognize that readers bring their own historical and cultural perspectives to text, meaning that interpretation can vary across time and place. The eighth feature would be emphasis on the marginalized. This approach often highlights voices that have been overlooked or suppressed, such as women, minorities, and colonized people. It questions how these groups were represented or erased in historical narratives. Ninth is the material conditions of literature. New historicism considers the physical and economic realities of literature, how texts were produced, who had access to them, and how they were distributed. This can reveal power dynamics in publishing and censorship. For the last feature, we have the blurring the line between high and popular culture. New historicism does not separate elite literature from everyday culture. It explores how both high art and popular media influence each other, showing that a Shakespearean play and a 16th century political pamphlet can be equally valuable in understanding history. Now, New historicism is not just about analyzing literature, it's about rethinking history itself. It teaches us to question dominant narratives, explore hidden voices, and see literature as a part of a larger cultural conversation. By applying this approach, this lens of analysis, we can uncover the deeper connections between literature, power, and society, making literary analysis not just an academic exercise, but a way to critically engage with the world around us.
So, New Historicism as a literary approach involves analyzing a given text in the context of its historical background. It began to gain popularity in 1980s. New Historicism includes considering the political, social, and economic conditions of the time the writer lived in. A person who analyzes literary piece based on its historical and external context are called new historicists. They see history as central to any and all texts. So one of the key proponents of new historicism is the American theorist Stephen Greenblatt. As the leading figure in New Historicism, Greenblatt's work focuses on the relationship between literature and the historical moment. His influential texts such as Renaissance Self-Fashioning and Learning to Curse explores how individuals construct their identities within the cultural frameworks of their time. He argues that literature is a form of cultural productions that reflects and shapes societal values. Another significant figure is Michel Foucault. Although not a new historicist himself, Foucault's ideas about power, knowledge, and discourse have significantly influenced the movement, or the new historicism. His concept of power and knowledge suggests that knowledge is not neutral but is intertwined with power relations, which has implications for how literature is understood in its historical context. In addition to analyzing the impact of historical context and ideology, new historicists also acknowledge that their own criticism contains biases that derive from their historical position and ideology. New historicists attempt to situate artistic texts both as products of historical context and as the means of understanding cultural and intellectual history.
We come now to the basic concepts of New Historicism. First is text and context are interrelated. Literature is not independent of history. It shapes and is shaped by historical events, social structures, and cultural ideologies. The next one is history as a narrative. History is not an objective, fixed account of events, but a series of narratives that are shaped by those who write them. This implies historical facts are frequently influenced by power, ideology, and perspective. The next one is ideology and power. New historicist Paro Michel focus theories on power, stating that literature represents and perpetuates dominant ideologies of the period, though often unintentionally. The next one is the marginalized role. New historicism attempts to discover the voices of marginalized or oppressed groups that conventional historical accounts might have ignored or silenced. The next is intertextuality. Literature is linked to other texts, both non literary, such as legal documents, personal letters, political speeches, which all help to know the time in which we are. And the last one is the present affects the past. How we understand history and literature is influenced by our modern day concerns and preconceptions. New historicists are conscious of their own time location when reading historical facts.
Good day everyone! Today I want to talk about the two important approach to study the history and literature of the old historicism and the new historicism. To put it simply, old historicism is how historians used to approach the history and literature before the 1980s. They are also typically viewed history as the straight lines of the event that could be objectively studied. And then, when they look at the literary text, they also saw them as a mainly product of their time period that is reflected the historical reality. New historicism, which emerged in the 1980s largely through the work of Stephen Greenblatt, that takes a completely different approach. It also suggests that texts don't just reflect history, they are also actively shape it too. And then, when we talk about the archival continuum in the new historicism, we are referring to how new historicists look at all kinds of texts, not just a famous literature, but also a diaries, newspapers, legal documents, and more as equally valuable sources for understanding culture. New historicism is especially interested in power relationship, while the old historicism might focus on kings, presidents, and major events. The new historicism pays attention to marginalized voices and everyday life. Perhaps most importantly, new historicism says history as text. This means that they believe we can never access the pure facts of history, that like we can only read the text left behind, which are already interpretation shaped by the cultural forces. So, in summary, old historicism sees literature as a window to historical truth, while the new historicism sees literature and history as a constantly interacting, with neither being more real than the other.
Good day, everyone. So, what historicists do? So, the historicists do, they literary and non-literary texts, reading the literature in the light of history. They defamiliarize the canonical literary text, detach it with from the accumulated weight of previous literary scholarships. They focused attention within both context and text on issues of state power and how it is maintained, on patriarchal structures, and on the process of colonizations, and etc. They use aspect of post-structuralist outlook, especially Derrida's notion that every facet of reality is textualized. So, literary historicism as a critical approach that examines literature through historical and power-based lenses, challenging traditional readings of by placing text in broader cultural and political contexts. So, historicism in literary studies combines element of historical analysis with post-structuralist theory to examine power relationship embedded in text. That's all.
So we come now to the advantages and disadvantages of new historicism. We have here 5 advantages of new historicism. 1. It helps readers understand literature by connecting it to historical and social events. This means that when we read a book, we don't just look at the story itself, but also at what was happening in the world when it was written. This helps us see why certain themes or ideas were included in the story. Number 2, it uses history, politics, and culture to analyze literature in a broader way. Instead of only looking at the words in a book, New Historicism also looks at history, politics, and culture. This helps us understand the deeper meaning behind the story and how it relates to the real world. Number 3, it examines how literature reflects or challenges power and social structures. Many books show how people in power control others, or how some groups fight back against unfair treatment. New historicism helps us see these ideas in stories and understand how they relate to real life struggles. Number 4, it questions the idea of absolute truth and highlights how history is shaped by perspective. Instead of believing that history is always 100% true, New historicism reminds us that history is often told from one point of view. Different people may see the same event in different ways, and this affects how history is written. Number 5, it makes readers rethink how history, literature, and society influence each other. Stories are shaped by history, but they also help shape the way people think about history and society. New historicism helps us see these connections and understand how literature plays a role in shaping our world. So, if new historicism has advantages, it also has disadvantages. We also have here 5 disadvantages of the new historicism. First, it argues that all history is biased, but its own interpretations can also be subjective. New historicism says that history is never completely true because it is told from someone's point of view. However, critics says that new historicism itself is also just another way of looking at things, meaning it is also biased. Number 2, it sometimes treats literature only as a historical document, ignoring its artistic value. When analyzing books, New Historicism focuses a lot on history and politics. Some people think this takes away from the beauty of the writing, the creativity of the author, and the artistic elements of the story. Number 3, it focuses too much on power and oppression, leaving out other important themes. New historicism often looks for struggles between powerful and powerless groups in stories. While this is important, it may ignore other themes like love, friendship, personal growth, or morality. Number 4, it does not have a strict method, which can lead to inconsistent interpretations. Unlike some other ways of studying literature, New Historicism does not follow a clear set of rules. This means different people might analyze the same book in very different ways, leading to confusion or disagreement. Number 5, it pays more attention to history and politics than to the literary style and structure of texts. While New Historicism focused on what was happening in the real world when a book was written, it sometimes ignores important things like how the book was written, its storytelling techniques, or its use of language. So, with that, New Historicism proves to be a valuable approach to literary analysis by linking literature to history, politics, and culture. It challenges absolute truth and highlights the influence of perspective on history. However, it can sometimes overlook artistic elements, focus too much power struggles, and lack a clear method. Despite these drawbacks, it remains a useful tool for understanding the deeper connections between literature and society.
Now, analyzing Annabel Lee through different lens of new historicism, one analyzation of this is that the poem explores class and gender relations of the 19th century, portraying a love that transcends social norms and idealizing Annabel Lee as a symbol of innocence. Now, the setting, which is Kingdom by the Sea, invokes nostalgia and isolation, which also reflects the Southern experience of loss during the antebellum period and highlighting cultural tensions of the time. Now, adding up, also the poem embodies the romantic movement, emphasizing emotions and personal experience, particularly the darker aspects of human existence, such as mortality. Its melancholic tone and themes of love and death resonates with 19th century cultural attitudes toward mourning and transformative nature of death. Now, adding up another analysis of this is, of course, it reflects Edgar Allan Poe's personal tragedy, particularly the death of his wife, which is Virginia Clem. And this poem serves as an expression of experience with love and loss. Now, understanding the poem, it shows that Poe's life enhances the poem's themes of timeless love and sorrow.